If you observe carefully what the Federal Reserve has been saying about inflation over the past 3 years, you'll notice something disturbing. Not the words themselves, but the pattern behind them. In early 2021, they called inflation transitory. By late 2022, they admitted it wasn't. Now in 2025, they're telling us inflation is under control at around 3%. But here's what they're not telling you. The methodology they use to measure inflation has been changed 17 times since 1980, and each change has systematically reduced the reported number. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented policy, and the implications for anyone holding cash or bonds right now are severe. This isn't a prediction. It's a logical consequence of understanding how monetary systems work under debt pressure. I've spent more than 40 years studying economic cycles, debt crises, and currency debasements across different countries and time periods. I've analyzed what happened in Weimar Germany in the 1920s, what happened in the United States in the 1970s, what happened in Argentina multiple times, and what's happening right now in over 30 countries experiencing currency crises. When you understand incentives, you understand behavior. And right now, the Federal Reserve has an incentive structure that makes honest inflation reporting almost impossible. Consider these 3 data points. The U.S. national debt stands at $36 trillion, requiring over $1.2 trillion in annual interest payments. Real wages, when adjusted using the 1980 CPI methodology, have declined 3.2% annually for 3 consecutive years. Meanwhile, home prices have increased 47% since 2020, while the official CPI shows only 19% cumulative inflation. These numbers don't align unless something fundamental is being obscured. To understand why the Fed cannot tell the truth about inflation, you need to understand the debt trap they're caught in. Think of it like a restaurant that's borrowed heavily to expand. If they admit food costs have doubled, they'd have to raise menu prices dramatically, customers would leave, revenue would collapse, and they couldn't service their debt. So instead, they change the menu. They reduce portion sizes, substitute cheaper ingredients, eliminate expensive items, and call it menu optimization rather than price increases. The Federal Reserve does exactly this with inflation measurement, but instead of portion sizes, they adjust the basket of goods, apply hedonic adjustments for quality improvements, and substitute cheaper alternatives when prices rise. The result is an official inflation number that bears little resemblance to what ordinary people experience at the grocery store, the gas pump, or the housing market. Right now, there are 4 enormous pressures forcing the Fed's hand. First, the interest payment burden. With $36 trillion in debt, every 1% increase in average interest rates costs $360 billion annually. At 5% rates, that's $1.8 trillion per year. Nearly 40% of all tax revenue just for interest. Second, the entitlement crisis. Social Security payments are indexed to CPI. Medicare costs rise with healthcare inflation. If the government reported real inflation of 8 to 10% instead of 3%, these programs would require an additional $400 billion annually. Third, political pressure. No administration wants to admit that real purchasing power is collapsing under their watch. And fourth, financial system stability. Banks, pension funds, and insurance companies hold trillions in bonds. If real inflation is acknowledged as much higher than stated, these bonds would need to be marked down significantly, potentially triggering a financial crisis worse than 2008. History is an excellent teacher if you know where to look. In 1971, President Nixon faced a similar dilemma. Gold was flowing out of the United States because foreign governments knew the dollar was overvalued relative to the gold standard promise of $35 per ounce. Nixon had a choice: honor the commitment and watch America's gold reserves disappear, or break the promise and close the gold window. He chose the latter on August 15, 1971. The result? Within a decade, gold went from $35 to $850, and Americans experienced the worst inflation in modern history, peaking at 14.8% in 1980. But here's the crucial detail most people miss. The government changed how it measured inflation multiple times during the 1970s and 1980s, specifically to make the numbers look better. They removed housing prices from CPI and replaced them with owner's equivalent rent. They introduced hedonic adjustments. They allowed for substitution effects. In the 1970s, after inflation became undeniable, the average American family saw their purchasing power cut in half over a decade, even as official numbers said inflation was only 7 to 8% annually. A family with $50,000 in savings in 1970 found that by 1980 those same dollars bought what $25,000 bought before. But it wasn't just savings that got destroyed. Bonds collapsed. The 30-year Treasury bond lost 67% of its purchasing power. Anyone who believed the government's assurances that inflation was temporary or under control paid an enormous price. Meanwhile, those who protected themselves with hard assets, gold, silver, real estate, commodities, not only preserved their wealth but multiplied it. Gold rose 2,400%. Real estate in major cities tripled in nominal terms and held its real value. The pattern was clear. When governments face unbearable debt burdens, they inflate their way out, and they hide the true inflation rate to prevent panic. Look at what happened in 2008. The Federal Reserve responded to the financial crisis by creating $3.7 trillion through quantitative easing. They told us this wouldn't cause inflation because of economic slack and low velocity of money. And for several years they appeared to be right, at least according to official CPI numbers that stayed below 2%. But asset prices told a different story. Stock markets doubled. Real estate in major cities recovered and then soared. College tuition increased 65%. Healthcare costs rose 55%. Where was the inflation? It was hidden in assets the CPI doesn't fully capture, and in hedonic adjustments that made computer and technology price drops offset real increases elsewhere. The money printing did cause inflation, just not where the government was looking, or more accurately, not where they wanted you to look. Now consider what's happened since 2020. The Federal Reserve and the U.S. government created over $6 trillion in new money in just 2 years. That's more money creation than occurred in the entire decade after 2008. They told us this was necessary to combat the pandemic and that inflation would be transitory. By late 2021, as inflation officially hit 7%, they finally admitted they were wrong. But even now, with official inflation at 3%, the real story is obscured. Housing costs, which represent the single largest expense for most Americans, have risen 47% in 5 years. The official CPI shows housing inflation of only 22% over the same period because of how owner's equivalent rent is calculated. Food prices are up 35 to 40% for basic staples, yet CPI shows 19%. Insurance costs have skyrocketed 30 to 50% depending on the type. The gap between lived experience and official statistics has never been wider. To understand inflation measurement, you need to understand 3 fundamental principles. First, the substitution principle. When steak gets too expensive, the CPI assumes you'll buy chicken instead, so it doesn't count the full price increase of steak because you theoretically substitute down. The problem? This measures the cost of survival, not the cost of maintaining your standard of living. If you could afford steak in 2020 but can only afford chicken in 2025, you've gotten poorer. But the CPI says inflation was modest because you adapted. This is like measuring poverty by assuming people will move from houses to apartments to trailer parks to tents and calling it lifestyle adjustment rather than decline. Second, the hedonic adjustment principle. This says that if a new iPhone costs $1,000 but has better features than last year's $900 iPhone, there's actually been deflation because you're getting more value. The government applies this logic across electronics, cars, appliances, and more. The problem? While your phone may have a better camera, your grocery bill is still higher. Your rent is still higher. Your insurance is still higher. Hedonic adjustments in technology offset real inflation in necessities, making the overall number artificially low. It's technically correct that you get more computing power per dollar, but that doesn't pay for food or shelter. Third, the weighting principle. The CPI assigns weights to different categories based on what percentage of spending they represent. But these weights can be adjusted, and they have been many times. Housing used to be weighted more heavily. Healthcare was less significant. Energy had more impact. Each time the methodology changes, it's presented as a technical improvement, more accurately reflecting spending patterns. But observe the pattern. Every single adjustment since 1980 has had the effect of lowering reported inflation compared to what the old methodology would have shown. That's not random. When you understand the incentive, you understand the behavior. Let me tell you a story about 2 teachers who retired in 2007, just before the financial crisis. Both were the same age. Both had saved $400,000 in their retirement accounts. Both were 58 years old. The first teacher, Margaret, listened to her financial advisor who said the safest approach was a traditional 60-40 portfolio. 60% in bond funds, 40% in stock index funds. She was told this was the prudent, conservative choice that would preserve capital and generate income. The second teacher, Robert, had a different perspective. He'd studied the 1970s and was concerned about what he called financial repression, where real interest rates are negative and savers get quietly destroyed. He put only 30% in stocks, 20% in treasury bonds for safety, but allocated 25% to gold, 15% to real estate investment trusts, and 10% to commodities. For the first few years through 2010, Margaret appeared to be doing better. Her portfolio was more stable, less volatile. Robert's gold allocation seemed excessive. His commodity positions seemed speculative. But then the real effects of quantitative easing began to show. From 2007 to 2024, here's what happened. Margaret's bond allocation, which started at $240,000, grew to $310,000 in nominal terms, a 29% gain. But adjusted for real inflation, not official CPI but actual purchasing power for a retiree, it lost 35% of its value. Her stock allocation grew from $160,000 to $420,000, a strong 162% gain. Her total portfolio went from $400,000 to $730,000. That sounds good until you adjust for real inflation. In terms of what that money could actually buy for her retirement needs, it was worth about $445,000 in 2007 dollars. She gained nominally but barely kept pace with real costs. Robert's experience was completely different. His stock allocation grew from $120,000 to $314,000, a 162% gain, same as Margaret. His bond allocation went from $80,000 to $103,000, a 29% gain. But his gold position, which started at $100,000, grew to $268,000, a 168% gain. His real estate investment trusts went from $60,000 to $178,000, a 197% gain. His commodity position went from $40,000 to $79,000, a 98% gain. His total portfolio went from $400,000 to $942,000. In real purchasing power terms, that was worth about $575,000 in 2007 dollars. He didn't just preserve wealth, he grew it significantly in real terms. The difference between them was $130,000 in real purchasing power, enough to provide an additional $5,200 per year in retirement income for the rest of their lives. This isn't made up. It's the typical pattern when you compare traditional portfolios to inflation-protected portfolios during periods of monetary expansion and hidden inflation. The teachers who understood that official inflation numbers were misleading and positioned accordingly came out far ahead. Those who trusted the system and followed conventional advice got quietly impoverished. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines, but steadily and relentlessly. Now let's translate this to what really matters, how this affects you personally. If you're 55 years old with $600,000 in retirement savings, and you have a typical allocation of 55% stocks, 35% bonds, 10% cash, you need to understand what happens if real inflation continues at 7 to 8% annually, while official inflation is reported at 3%. Over the next 10 years until you're 65, your stock allocation might grow at 8% nominally, reaching $19 million. Your bond allocation might grow at 4% nominally, reaching $519,000. Your cash stays at $60,000. Total portfolio, $1.77 million. That looks like substantial growth from $600,000. But if real inflation is 7.5% annually, the purchasing power of $1.77 million in 10 years equals only $860,000 in today's dollars. You haven't doubled your wealth. You've increased it by only 43% in real terms. Now consider your expenses. Your current annual expenses might be $60,000. In 10 years, at 7.5% real inflation, you'll need $124,000 annually to maintain the same lifestyle. Your $1.77 million nominal portfolio provides a 4% safe withdrawal rate of $70,800 per year. That's only 57% of what you need. You'll either have to dramatically reduce your living standard or risk running out of money in your 70s. This is the hidden crisis that millions of retirees and near retirees are facing. The math doesn't work if real inflation is significantly higher than reported inflation. Social Security will provide some buffer, but those payments are indexed to official CPI, not real inflation, so they'll lag behind your actual costs. The gap between what you expected retirement to look like and what it actually looks like could be devastating. This is why understanding the Fed's incentive to understate inflation isn't academic. It's directly relevant to your financial survival. Based on these principles, here are practical guidelines for protecting yourself. First, reduce bond exposure significantly. In a high real inflation environment, long-term bonds are wealth destroyers. I would suggest no more than 20% of a portfolio in bonds, and those should be short duration, under 3 years to maturity. The traditional 60-40 portfolio was designed for a different era when interest rates were higher than inflation. That era is over. Second, allocate 25 to 30% to inflation-protected assets. This means gold, silver, commodities, or commodity-producing stocks. Gold specifically has no counterparty risk and has preserved purchasing power across every major currency debasement in history. A 25% allocation isn't speculation. It's insurance against exactly what we're seeing, a government that cannot afford to acknowledge real inflation. Third, maintain 30 to 40% in equities, but focus on companies with pricing power, hard assets, or international exposure. Companies that can pass costs to consumers, own real assets like land or resources, or generate revenue in multiple currencies will fare better than companies with fixed-price contracts or heavy debt loads. Fourth, allocate 10 to 15% to real estate or real estate investment trusts. Real estate is a tangible asset that typically appreciates with inflation. It provides both inflation protection and income. Avoid being too concentrated in your local market. Diversify geographically. Fifth, keep 5 to 10% in cash for opportunities and emergencies, but no more. Cash is trash in a high inflation environment, losing 7 to 8% of purchasing power annually. You need some for liquidity, but hoarding cash is a guaranteed way to get poorer. Implement these changes gradually over 6 to 12 months. Don't sell everything tomorrow and create tax consequences or buy at temporary tops. Dollar cost average into new positions. The goal is to be positioned appropriately before the gap between official and real inflation becomes impossible to ignore, before others realize what's happening and prices of protective assets surge. Nothing in this constitutes specific financial advice for your individual situation. Everyone's circumstances, risk tolerance, time horizon, and goals are different. You should consult with qualified financial professionals who understand your complete financial picture before making significant portfolio changes. The choice is yours, but remember what's actually happening right now. Central banks around the world have bought over 1,150 tons of gold in 2024 alone, the highest level since 1950. Why would central banks, who can print their own currency, be buying gold at these levels? Because they understand what's coming. The Bank of China, the Reserve Bank of India, the Central Bank of Poland, they're not buying gold because it pays interest. They're buying it because they know their own currencies are being debased. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the largest in the world, reduced bond holdings to the lowest level in 20 years and increased allocations to real assets. These are the most sophisticated institutional investors in the world, and they're moving away from traditional safe assets and toward inflation protection. Retail investors, the people watching this channel, are largely still positioned for the world that existed from 1980 to 2020, a world of declining inflation and interest rates, where bonds were safe and cash was reasonable. That world ended in 2020 with the massive monetary expansion. We're now in a world much more similar to the 1970s, where protecting purchasing power requires different strategies. The gap between what institutions are doing and what retail investors are doing has never been wider. That gap represents both a danger for those who don't adjust and an opportunity for those who do. That's why this channel exists, to observe the signals before they become obvious, to understand the incentives that drive policy decisions, to translate complex economic dynamics into practical implications for real people trying to protect decades of savings. If this analysis makes sense to you, if you see the logic in understanding why the Fed cannot tell the truth about inflation and what that means for your portfolio, then subscribe to this channel. Because what I've shared today is just the beginning of understanding how to navigate what's coming. The Fed isn't lying about inflation out of malice. They're lying because the truth is incompatible with the system's survival. And when the system's survival conflicts with your purchasing power, the system will always choose itself. Your job is to understand that dynamic and position accordingly. The choice, as always, is yours.